3 in the morning, while I was asleep, someone drained every gallon out of my backyard pool. And by the time the sun came up, they had already left a fine hanging from my front gate like they expected me to apologize. 72 hours later, 46 luxury homes woke up without a single drop of running water. And suddenly the same people who laughed at my old ranch house couldn't stop pounding on my front door. Funny thing about power. Sometimes the person who has the least expensive house on the block is the one holding everything together. And nobody notices until they decide to push him too far. My name is Harold Mercer. I'm 72 years old, retired after spending almost 4 decades designing municipal water systems across Arizona, and I've lived in the same little ranch house outside Cedar Ridge Estates longer than anyone else around here. When my wife Diane was still alive, we'd sit on the cracked concrete patio every evening with iced tea, watching the desert sky turn orange while the coyotes started singing somewhere beyond the hills. She used to joke that our house looked like it had survived every decade since disco, while everything around us kept pretending to be brand new. After she passed away 6 years ago, I never had the heart to remodel. The faded blue paint stayed faded. The gravel driveway stayed gravel. My chain-link fence stayed exactly where my father and I installed it back in 1979. Meanwhile, the empty desert surrounding me slowly transformed into a parade of million-dollar homes with infinity pools, imported palm trees, outdoor kitchens bigger than my living room, and neighbors who seemed convinced that expensive landscaping automatically made them better human beings. At first, everyone was polite enough. They waved, they smiled, they even brought cookies the first Christmas. That changed the day the Homeowners Association elected Vanessa Holloway as president. Vanessa wasn't loud. Loud people are easy to spot. She was polished, calculated, always smiling while finding new ways to remind people who she thought belonged and who didn't. According to her, my old truck lowered neighborhood values. My mailbox wasn't modern enough. My fence looked outdated. My roof color wasn't harmonious with the community vision. Even though my house had been sitting there almost 30 years before the first HOA document was ever written. Every month, another warning letter appeared. Every meeting included another speech about community standards. I mostly ignored it because I'd learned something after 70 years on this earth. People obsessed with appearances usually overlook what's underneath. My next-door neighbor, Frank Dawson, stopped by one afternoon carrying a six-pack and shook his head while looking at another violation notice taped to my mailbox. "They're never gonna quit, are they?" he asked. I laughed. "No, Frank, because I think this is about paint colors." He looked confused. "Then what's it really about?" I shrugged. "Control." He nodded slowly like he understood. But honestly, I don't think anybody really did. A few weeks later, Cedar Ridge entered what the county called voluntary drought conservation. Everybody was encouraged to reduce outdoor water use. Encouraged, not ordered. I followed every recommendation anyway. My pool had an automatic cover. My irrigation ran before sunrise. I hadn't broken a single county regulation. Apparently that didn't matter. Tuesday morning, I walked outside carrying my coffee and almost dropped the mug. My pool was empty. Completely empty. The deep blue water Diane loved so much was gone, replaced by stained concrete covered with white mineral rings. The pump was still humming uselessly, sucking air. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was still dreaming. Then I saw the laminated notice zip-tied neatly to my front gate. Community water violation. Excessive recreational water usage during drought period. $500 daily penalty until corrective action verified. Signed, Vanessa Holloway, HOA President. I read it 3 times. Then I walked around the yard. The drain valve had been forced open. Somebody had climbed my fence in the middle of the night, emptied 1,800 gallons of salt water, locked everything back up, and left me the bill. Frank wandered over 20 minutes later after seeing me standing there. "Harold, what the hell happened?" I handed him the notice without saying a word. His face turned red before he'd even finished reading. "They can't do this." I smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile people expect. It was the smile Diane used to recognize whenever somebody had made a mistake they wouldn't understand until much later. "You're right," I said quietly. "They can't." Frank looked at the empty pool, then back at me. "So, lawyer?" I looked toward the hills behind the subdivision where 6 small utility buildings blended into the desert like they'd always been part of the landscape. Then I looked back at my old garage, walked inside without answering him, and opened the steel filing cabinet that hadn't been touched in years. Buried beneath engineering drawings, tax records, and faded family photographs sat a thick leather folder with my father's handwriting across the front. I carried it onto the kitchen table, brushed away a layer of dust, opened it slowly, and smiled for the first time that morning because inside those yellowed pages was a document nobody in Cedar Ridge Estates even knew existed. And before sunset, I had already decided I wasn't going to sue the HOA. I was going to remind them exactly whose water had been flowing through their faucets all these years. That folder had belonged to my father before it belonged to me, and before that it had sat inside a safe in the office of the small drilling company that no longer existed. Most people inherit family photos or old watches. I inherited paperwork. Growing up, I never understood why Dad guarded those documents like they were gold. When I was 12, I once asked him why he kept reading the same yellow maps over and over again. He smiled, folded them carefully, and said, "Son, land isn't always what you see on top of it. Sometimes the most valuable thing is buried where nobody bothers looking." It wasn't until decades later, after becoming a civil engineer myself, that those words finally made sense. Inside the folder sat the original mineral and groundwater extraction agreement recorded in 1978, long before developers ever dreamed of building luxury homes across this stretch of Arizona desert. Along with it were engineering surveys, pumping permits, environmental approvals, maintenance contracts, and one document that mattered more than all the others combined: the deed granting permanent extraction rights to the aquifer beneath every acre that now made up Cedar Ridge Estates. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath, while memories started coming back. Back then, this whole valley was nothing but mesquite trees, jackrabbits, and hard-packed dirt. My father partnered with 3 investors to drill exploratory wells after geological surveys confirmed a massive underground water source. The other investors eventually sold their shares when development money started rolling in, but Dad refused. Instead, he created Mercer Water Services, transferred everything into a holding company, and quietly leased distribution rights to the subdivision developer decades earlier. The developers changed, ownership changed, HOA presidents came and went, but one thing never changed. Every gallon flowing into Cedar Ridge still passed through infrastructure my family owned. Somewhere along the way, people stopped asking questions. Monthly utility bills arrived. They paid them through an escrow company. Nobody bothered tracing where the money ultimately ended up because convenience has a funny way of making people lazy. They simply assumed the city handled everything. The city didn't. I did. Well, technically the holding company did. But after my father passed away, I became the sole trustee. I called my attorney, Melissa Grant, someone I'd known almost 20 years. She answered before the second ring. "Harold, what's wrong?" "Somebody drained my pool." She went quiet. "Accident?" "No." "HOA." Another pause. "Tell me you haven't done anything yet." "Not yet." "Good. Come see me." 40 minutes later, I spread every document across her conference table. She read in complete silence for nearly half an hour, occasionally adjusting her glasses while comparing survey maps against digital county records. Finally, she looked up with the kind of smile attorneys rarely show unless they're absolutely certain. "Do they know?" she asked. "Not a chance." "And your operating permits are current?" I slid another folder toward her. "Renewed 18 months ago." She laughed softly. "Harold, this might be one of the strangest cases I've ever seen. Can I legally terminate service?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she flipped through another contract, highlighting several paragraphs. "You can't retaliate emotionally. But," she tapped the page with her pen, "you absolutely can suspend commercial service after proper notice if the customer materially interferes with company property or violates contractual obligations. And trespassing to destroy private property certainly qualifies." "How much notice?" 72 hours. I smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." By noon, I was driving out to Pump Station 3, a squat concrete building most residents probably assumed belonged to the city. I'd helped design half the upgrades inside that building 15 years earlier. The electric hum of industrial pumps sounded almost comforting, like hearing an old friend clear his throat. I shut down the primary distribution system, leaving only the dedicated residential line feeding my own property active. Then I repeated the process at the remaining stations. Everything was documented, every valve photographed, every breaker tagged. I installed fresh padlocks and mounted bright warning signs stating private water facility authorized personnel only. Before sunset, Melissa had certified 46 legal notices. They weren't threatening. They weren't emotional. They simply informed each homeowner that Mercer Water Services would discontinue private distribution in 72 hours, pending resolution of contractual violations and outstanding administrative issues. Certified mail. Signature required. Perfectly legal. Frank nearly spit out his coffee when I handed him a copy. You're actually doing it. I am. They're gonna lose their minds. Probably. You enjoying this? I thought about that question longer than he expected. No. I would have enjoyed sitting beside my pool this morning with nobody bothering me. This is just what comes after people mistake kindness for weakness. Word spread fast. By evening, neighborhood social media groups exploded. Some homeowners called the notices fake. Others insisted it had to be a scam. Vanessa posted a long message accusing an unnamed resident of attempting to intimidate the community with fraudulent legal documents. She even promised immediate legal action against anyone interfering with municipal utilities. That post aged badly. The following morning, the first phone calls reached the city water department. Frank later told me he overheard one of the conversations on speaker while his wife chatted with another neighbor. The city employee patiently searched every database before saying, "Ma'am, Cedar Ridge Estates has never received municipal water service. You're listed as a privately supplied district." Silence. Then, "That can't be right," the employee answered. "I'm sorry, but according to our records, it is." By late afternoon, sprinklers across the neighborhood started coughing little bursts of air before falling silent. Bright green lawns already looked dull around the edges. Nobody panicked yet. People assumed it was temporary. They always do. Vanessa drove past my house twice that evening without stopping. She slowed down enough to glare at me while I watered my vegetable garden using the only active residential line still running. I waved politely. She didn't wave back. The second warning brought something much harder to ignore. Toilets stopped refilling. Kitchen faucets sputtered. Ice makers clicked helplessly. Luxury landscaping worth hundreds of thousands of dollars began baking beneath the Arizona sun. Contractors showed up at 3 different homes before admitting they couldn't fix anything because the problem wasn't inside individual properties. It was upstream. Around lunchtime, a white SUV screeched into my driveway. Vanessa climbed out wearing oversized sunglasses and a pressed white blouse that somehow already showed sweat around the collar. She marched toward my porch carrying a folder like it was evidence in a criminal trial. "You're creating a public health emergency," she snapped before I even opened the screen door. "Good afternoon to you too. Turn the water back on. It's private infrastructure. It serves this neighborhood." "Correct. Then you can't deny access." Actually, I reached inside, picked up the certified delivery receipt she'd signed the previous afternoon. "According to Section 14 of the distribution agreement, I can suspend service after documented interference with company assets and contractual violations." Her face tightened. "What agreement?" Exactly. For the first time since she'd become HOA president, the confidence disappeared from her eyes. Just for a second. But I caught it. She realized there were pieces of this neighborhood's history she'd never bothered learning because she assumed she already knew everything worth knowing. She recovered quickly. "Our attorneys will destroy you. They should probably read the paperwork first. You're bluffing." "Am I?" She stared at me another few seconds before turning sharply and walking back to her SUV. As she drove away, Frank wandered across the street carrying binoculars around his neck. "Binoculars?" I asked. He grinned. "Front row seat." I laughed harder than I had in months. "Frank, you're terrible." "Maybe, but this is better than cable television." By sunset, the neighborhood no longer looked like the glossy brochure that had convinced so many people to move there. Palm trees drooped. Decorative fountains sat silent. Children complained they couldn't shower after swimming practice. Homeowners who had ignored each other for years suddenly gathered in driveways comparing rumors. Some blamed the HOA. Others blamed me. A few simply wanted answers. Then, just before dark, Melissa called. "Harold." Vanessa's law firm requested every original contract. "Did you send them?" "5 minutes ago." "And?" Melissa chuckled. "Let's just say they're going to have a very interesting morning. Because buried inside that packet wasn't just proof that my family owned the water system. There was also an accounting statement nobody outside my office had ever seen. One that calculated nearly 2 decades of unpaid commercial royalties, maintenance adjustments, and contractual penalties that had quietly accumulated into a number so large it would make every single homeowner in Cedar Ridge question everything they'd ever been told about who was really in charge. The phone started ringing before 8 the next morning, but I let every call go to voicemail. There comes a point in life when you've explained yourself enough, and after that, silence becomes a perfectly reasonable response. Around 9:30, Melissa called instead. "You should probably be here," she said. "Why?" "Because their attorneys just stopped arguing." That got my attention. When I walked into her office 20 minutes later, 3 men in expensive suits were sitting across the conference table looking nothing like the confident legal team Vanessa had promised would destroy me. Their lead attorney stood up, extended his hand, and sighed before speaking. "Mr. Mercer, I think we've all been working with incomplete information." I couldn't help smiling. Seems to be a theme around here. He slid a thick folder across the table. "We've reviewed the original distribution agreements, county filings, easements, renewal permits, operating licenses, and payment schedules. And they're valid." Melissa leaned back without saying a word. She didn't need to. The paperwork had already done all the talking. The attorney continued carefully. "There is, however, another issue." He opened a spreadsheet that ran page after page. The HOA management company amended billing procedures approximately 18 years ago. During that transition, contractual royalty adjustments were never implemented. "Meaning?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Meaning the community has been paying standard operating fees, but not the commercial royalty provisions required under the original lease." I nodded slowly. "So what's the balance?" He cleared his throat. "Including maintenance allocations, meter replacement reserves, inflation adjustments, and contractual penalties." He looked down again before finishing. "Approximately $3,400,000. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound in the room came from the air conditioner humming overhead. Finally, one of the younger attorneys muttered almost to himself. "I've never seen anything like this." Melissa smiled. "Neither have I." Less than an hour later, there was a knock on my front door. This time, Vanessa wasn't wearing designer sunglasses or carrying violation notices. Her hair was tied back in a hurry. Her makeup had almost disappeared in the Arizona heat, and the confidence that once filled every sentence was completely gone. Behind her stood nearly a dozen homeowners, including several people who had barely acknowledged my existence for years. Nobody looked angry anymore. They looked exhausted. Vanessa took a slow breath. "Can we talk?" I stepped onto the porch and quietly closed the screen door behind me. "We're talking." She hesitated before saying words I honestly never expected to hear. "I made a mistake." I looked at the empty pool behind me. "Several, actually." She lowered her eyes. "I believed the board when they said your property was hurting the neighborhood. My property wasn't the problem. I know that now." There was another long silence before she asked, "What will it take to fix this?" I didn't answer immediately because, truthfully, I'd been thinking about that question since the morning I found my pool empty. Revenge would have been easy. Bankrupting the HOA probably wasn't impossible either. But Diane used to remind me that winning and humiliating someone weren't always the same thing. Sometimes the better victory is making sure they never repeat the mistake. I handed Vanessa a folder. Inside was a proposal Melissa and I had finished the night before. Every homeowner would sign a brand new 25-year water service agreement. Smart meters would finally be installed across the community. Future maintenance would be transparent. Any landscaping changes affecting water demand required engineering approval instead of arbitrary HOA opinions. Most importantly, the outstanding royalties would be placed into escrow under a long-term payment schedule, instead of destroying families who had never even known the original agreement existed. Vanessa looked through the pages with trembling hands. "That's surprisingly fair," I shrugged. "I never wanted your houses. I just wanted you off my property." A man standing behind her finally spoke up. "Did the board really authorize draining your pool?" Vanessa closed her eyes for just a second before answering, "Yes." Another homeowner stepped forward. "Without a court order?" She nodded. The crowd erupted almost immediately. Questions turned into accusations. Accusations turned into shouting. People who had spent years trusting the HOA suddenly realized how much had been hidden from them. I simply stepped back inside and let them have the conversation they should have had long before my pool was ever touched. 3 days later, the community held an emergency meeting. Every one of the 46 households signed the revised agreement. The management company accepted responsibility for years of administrative failures. The escrow account was funded. Professional audits became mandatory. And before the meeting ended, Vanessa stood one final time, removed her nameplate from the president's desk, announced her resignation, and accepted a bylaw amendment preventing her from serving on the HOA board again for the next 10 years. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. Some endings don't need cheering because the lesson is already loud enough. A month later, my pool was full again. Frank wandered over carrying 2 lawn chairs and a cooler. He looked across the neighborhood where sprinklers quietly watered fresh green lawns once more. "Everything back to normal?" he asked. I laughed and shook my head. "No, Frank. Better than normal." "How so?" I looked around at the same houses, the same streets, the same desert sunset Diane loved so much. Now, they finally know this community wasn't built by people who shouted the loudest. It was built by people who understood what was underneath it. He raised his drink. "To old paperwork." I clinked my bottle against his. "To never underestimating the quiet neighbor." And every now and then, when I walk past that filing cabinet in the garage, I think about how close I came to solving everything with anger instead of patience. The funny thing is, the water was never the real story. Respect was. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far by shutting off the water after what they did to my property? Or was it the only language that HOA would ever understand? Have you ever dealt with a homeowners association, a neighbor, or someone in power who believed they could push people around until they picked the wrong person? Share your story in the comments because I genuinely love to read it. And if you enjoy real stories about justice, property rights, and those unforgettable moments when arrogance finally meets accountability, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.